Shannon, I've been looking recently at solar power. I think solar power is really the way that we need to go to get us off oil for good.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, like, for example, say everyone had solar panels on their roof. The result would be a significant drop in the demand for oil-based energy to heat and power our homes.
And how do we get that?
Well, I've been thinking, the government's new committee to revise the high school curriculum. Well, I think we should look at this STEM thing as a way of stimulating research and development in solar panels.
That is a fantastic idea. I think it's also important to consider that STEM can serve national interests as well. I mean, we've seen so many reports about the lack of STEM workers, as well as how other countries are winning the race to educate our kids. For example, 1/3 of all bachelor's degrees awarded in China are in engineering, while in the US that number is only 5%.
Same problem in Canada. Too many of our high school graduates are not choosing STEM careers. To me, this is like the space race of the 1960s, only now the new challenge is the environment. I mean, imagine if we could direct all that creative energy of students towards developing alternative power sources like solar.
I think you're right. We are facing many challenges, including the challenge of producing sustainable alternative energy. We're about to be hit by the full force of global competition. If we continue to ignore the obvious task at hand while others beat us at our own game, our children and grandchildren will pay the price.
I mean, I agree, it's really urgent. Already by 2013, it was the warmest year we've had on the planet since we've been keeping our records of that. And now 2014 is looking like it will be warmer still. I mean, I think STEM could really help.
What do you mean by STEM?
STEM. Oh, I'm glad you could join us. STEM. STEM stands for science, technology, environment, and I always forget the last one. Medicine? Yeah, medicine, like biotech or something like that.
Are you sure? Doesn't it stand for science, technology, engineering, and math?
That's my understanding too. It seems to me people keep playing with the acronym. Lately I've been hearing about STEAM, for instance. It's something about art, I think.
Well, to be honest, the first time when I heard it, I thought it was all about stem cells or something like that.
But actually, lots of teachers still do, David. The New York Times reported on a study that asked 5,000 teachers if they understood the term STEM education, and 86% said no.
I mean, where did the acronym STEM come from anyway?
Well, it's not easy tracing the history of STEM as an idea. I think the ideas first appeared in the 1990s as governments in the US and Canada looked at national standards. For example, in 2005, the U.S. Amendment to the Higher Education Act included several new provisions to encourage students to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM.
Okay, wow. We could have a whole generation of STEM students working on alternative energy.
Well, I'm all for developing alternative energy sources. STEM, to me, is much more than that.
What do you mean?
I'd love to say more about this, but unfortunately, I've got to go. Let's get together tomorrow.
Sure.
Sure.
No, it works for me.
Yeah, it works for me.
The next day.
We're caught.
The script.
Oh, the script.
Well, David, what did you find out about solar energy?
Well, it's really depressing. Well, silicon is one of the most abundant elements on the Earth. It's locked in as silicon dioxide, and removing the oxygen requires toxic chemicals and, worse, incredible amounts of energy.
I read somewhere that there is some promising work on the use of carbon for solar panels.
Well, that would be something. Maybe STEM could help us find new materials that wouldn't be so expensive to extract and use.
Well, that's precisely the problem as I see it. We're looking for STEM as a kind of social salvation. We're putting off addressing problems now, hoping we can do a technical fix tomorrow.
What do you mean?
The E in STEM is, as I understand it, engineering. So STEM is all about engineering a better future.
What's wrong with that, Matthew? Don't we need science and engineering to help us out of our environmental crises?
And STEM gives our nations the competitive edge.
That's right.
If we can do this, our nations will be stronger, more inventive, and able to compete in the global marketplace.
But this focus on STEM is a shift in the curriculum, right? I think we need to ask, what does it enable and what does it exclude?
I think it enables higher education standards because the idea of competing in a good way would be part of the whole education system. We'd all be working together for prosperity to get ahead.
And we'd all be able to focus on real, tangible needs, like the development of alternative energy sources.
But it's a globalized economy, right? So the first world nations don't get ahead, they fall behind. Our economies will need to decline to become competitive. So this is really about wage lowering in the first world, not getting ahead.
What does this have to do with STEM?
Well, the STEM corporate players like Gates, Dell, the big pharmaceutical companies and the like, they need to lower their wages to be competitive in the global economy, especially in fields like science and engineering, since STEM is a major part of corporate activity. Educating more engineers means more competition for those jobs, and that means lowering wages. In the end, it's not nations that are getting ahead, it's a small group of plutocrats.
I disagree, Matthew. Wouldn't STEM help our nations compete in a global economy while providing citizens with the resources they need? After all, aren't we all consumers anyway?
And that's another problem, consumption. Framing consumption of new technology, including solar cells, places us completely under the agenda of corporations. I worry then that they are the ones really running things.
So?
Well, with the rise of corporations, I worry about democracy and about our ability to have say over the courses of our lives and practices. I especially worry that those marginalized by the system are increasingly dominated by STEM agenda, which sidelines questions of power, culture, government, collectivity, and race, at least in the US, is always a critical issue.
Okay, but I'm not sure. Let's just talk about David's idea of solar panels. Isn't this a good example of how STEM can help us? And isn't the development and production of these panels fundamentally a corporate project?
With the global population growing by nearly 1 million people a week, focusing on how to maintain our standards of living and thus energy consumption misses the point. If we humans and other animals are to survive, we have to lower our energy needs. That means consuming less, competing less, and sharing more.
But doesn't science hold the key to our survival?
And to our prosperity and leadership in the world?
Like the 1960s reforms, STEM uses humans in the material struggle for economic leadership. It's a giant discourse using people in the transformation of the world. It's social engineering.
But isn't everyone, in one sense, part of the machinery of capitalism?
And we are, but hopefully we still have choices, and that it is possible to live a life not governed only by economic logic. But when STEM starts to be the only game, choice is limited to only those related to an economized version of science, science bound to engineering.
So, are you saying this is really about freedom?
It's even bigger than that. Although freedom is a key issue, STEM is also about a misplaced hope in science and technology, in engineers, to invent our way out of our current problems, social and environmental. It's like we're trapped into only one way to think, that is thinking STEM as the way to secure the future, but a future that is completely linked to corporate agendas.
Why are you so concerned about corporations?
Well, because corporations usually don't have the best interests of people at heart. Corporations are legally focused on increasing profits to their shareholders. One result of this focus on profit has been the growing distance between the rich and the poor, both within nations and between nations. I see STEM as an increase in this social engineering, more profit to corporations, and now corporations having schools working for them too. STEM becomes an encompassing discourse.
Have to think on that one. Are you both around next week?
Oh yeah.
Great, let's meet 1 week from today. I'd like to continue this conversation.
Hi guys, good to see you back. I've been thinking more about this idea of STEM. I still can't see why you're so opposed to science and STEM as an emphasis in schools.
I'm not opposed to science at all, David. It's not science itself. It's how science is being used to enable and promote a neoliberal agenda.
Wow, that's quite a line, David. I've heard the phrase neoliberalism before, but I'm not sure what it is and what it has to do with STEM.
Well, I've been doing some reading this past week about neoliberalism. It's hard to say. Neoliberalism, as I understand it, is kind of an economic belief system that proposes that human well-being can be best advanced by liberating individuals, kind of freeing them up to be entrepreneurs, using their skills, through institutions that support strong private property rights, free markets, and of course, free trade.
Well, that actually sounds like a great idea to me. It's giving people opportunity to achieve their dreams by their own efforts, like inventing new types of solar panels. I can see how STEM would be useful to support neoliberal ideas.
But neoliberalism is much more, Shannon. It's an ironic, radical individualism.
What's ironic about it?
Well, on the one hand, the neoliberal agenda promotes the ethos of individualistic free enterprise. But in practice, this agenda really supports large corporations and creating a permanent wealthy class.
How so?
Right, well, no, I think I see what he's saying. By allowing corporations to be legally represented as individuals, this then supports legislation that removes any checks on these corporations.
It's about monies and minds, where instead of being free to pursue their dreams, individuals are appropriated into a corporate agenda. This happens when profit is the only measure of how a nation is doing.
Well, I see what you're saying, Matthew. So neoliberalism positions profit over the long-held educational values like collective well-being, social justice, democratic education, and public life.
But surely it's possible to have values like social justice and profit.
Not usually, Shannon. Oh, my goodness. Neoliberalism denounces social democracy as a recipe for an interventionist government that they believe threatens individual liberty through taxes and other regulations. Take housing for the poor, for instance. From a neoliberal perspective, the poor need to find ways to help themselves. Corporations especially do not wish to pay taxes for such programs. They see such taxes for social issues as barriers to their profits.
Okay, I think I see what you're saying, but I don't see how STEM is a part of all of this. It's just science, after all, and science itself is not political.
Oh, yes it is. Yes it is. Science is never value neutral. Science is always embedded culturally, and so scientific truth is always conditional. It is never value-free, impartial, disinterested, or objective.
And science certainly has had devastating effects on the environment, developing countries, and indigenous peoples. Science has deep and broad consequences, and these can privilege some and marginalize others in their everyday lives.
So let me ask the question, what would this mean for STEM science education?
Well, I suppose STEM could be a kind of science education that encourages students to be suspicious and maybe even critical of how science is used, of a kind of neoliberalism in science.
That's a new idea to me. Science education as suspicious about science, or critiquing STEM.
Or at least asking questions about STEM, like how does STEM's neoliberalism and positivism affect marginalized groups of people? And how does it affect the way we interact with our environment? How does STEMification of education shape the way students will shape the problems and solutions of science and science policy?
So I'm seeing a bit of nuance that I didn't before. You're asking some very philosophical questions that don't seem to be addressed in the way we currently talk about or do STEM. You're not necessarily saying science should be thrown out entirely, right? What you object to is that we are prioritizing market-driven solutions to problems of democracy and social justice.
Yes, and now going back to our discussion earlier about solar energy, these solutions don't even begin to move us towards less consumption.
Donna Haraway sums it up really nicely, I think. We need a commitment to what she says are earth-wide projects of finite freedom, adequate material abundance, modest meaning in suffering, and limited happiness.
Yes, like for example, solar power is a technological fix to the real problem of excessive energy consumption. Nowhere in the discussion of solar energy, getting off oil, etc., is the idea that maybe we should start driving less, using less, because using is part of the capital notion of increasing GDP. Solar is just a shift in objects, but not a change in our being in the world. So really, solar is not a change at all in our orientation to the world.
So then STEM could potentially be a solution to many problems, but it's STEM's framing of the problems themselves that is the issue.
Exactly. My hope is that there is a role for science, maybe even for STEM, not compromised by neoliberalism. At the very least, I hope that we can create some pockets of resistance to the neoliberal model of science education.
That's a difficult hope. We're all complicit in consumption and individualism in our everyday lives. It's definitely an uphill battle to change the way science and science education is framed in neoliberal ideologies and positivist epistemologies. Yet we need to challenge the neoliberal appropriation of STEM, even see the formation of the acronym STEM as an extension of neoliberalism.
So essentially, you're saying we should try to redefine STEM or even work within existing frameworks and operate in a kind of complicity as infiltration in order to reshape and redirect the discourse. So that could be a role for professors and teachers of science education.
Yeah, teachers, for sure. I also think we need to change our own assumptions as agents of change. We need to look for partners in change. I think we need to avoid idealistic statements or essentializing, even essentializing corporations as evil. Maybe we should use agencies like the NSF and federal governments to undermine and bring to light the capitalist assumptions behind change, to challenge the assumptions that marginalize and cause suffering and degrade the earth.
I like the way that approach welcomes all sorts of players to the party.
So STEM could be an opportunity for change, change that is socially just, if we ask questions and step back to see the bigger picture. STEM needs to move beyond just the content, the four letters of the acronym, so that other questions are posed.
You know, science education has a tradition of exploring bigger questions in progressive branches of the old STSE. Remember that movement? Maybe we can create a new curriculum vision. Science, technology, engineering, environment, math, society, STEAMs. At least opening the STEM discourse to something like this would allow teachers like me to do more than just critique STEM, but to connect science education to larger issues like social justice, rather than just focusing on technological fixes.
The end.